to Short Story Boudoir. I'm Katy Gathright.
And I'm Samantha Neugebauer, and today we have a special guest with us.
Nathan Blansett. Hi, happy to be here.
We're happy to have you. Nathan is a friend of ours from our MFA program at Hopkins. Nathan, would you like to tell our viewers a little bit about yourself? Anything else you want to say?
So the three of us do go way back. We were all graduate students in the writing seminars at Hopkins. Samantha and Katy were in the fiction program. I'm a poet and a book critic, and I'm also an English teacher at a private high school here in Washington.
Wonderful. We're so happy to have you.
Yeah, happy to be here.
And actually the story we're reading today is thanks to Nathan. He was the one who first introduced us to it, and we subsequently taught it in our courses at Hopkins. So maybe that's a good way to begin. Can you tell us a little bit about this story, the summary and everything?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So the story we'll be talking about today is called The Young Painters by Nicole Krauss. And The Young Painters starts with our protagonist, who is unnamed, but we do know that she's a writer. And the story starts with our protagonist addressing Your Honor, a judge, right? So the story opens with essentially a dinner party. Our protagonist is there. The host of the party is a German dancer that she's friends with. She kind of goes off to the bathroom at some point in the party, and she encounters this kind of strange abstract painting. It takes her back. She kind of saunters back into the party, and she inquires to the dancer, "What's up with the painting in your bathroom?" And that's how the story kind of sets in motion. And the dancer tells our protagonist a story about the origin of the painting. The painting was done by his childhood friends, actually. But the story has a kind of macabre twist. The young painters, the titular young painters who made this work, they were killed by their mother, who slipped sleeping pills into their tea and immolated herself along with them in a car. This is a light dinner party conversation. Understandably, our protagonist is really disturbed by the story. And eventually she decides to actually make it into art. She writes a story about it where she sort of imagines the lives of the young painters. She kind of fills in the gaps in the dancer's story. Her story gets accepted by a prominent magazine, and it seems as if things are abated, right? She can kind of let go of this really kind of haunting story. We learn more about her career as a writer. We learn that she publishes a novel about the abject, really slow, degrading death of her father. She mulls over the ethics of writing about real people. And then the story kind of reaches a climax. Years pass in a paragraph, and she encounters the dancer in Washington Square Park, the dancer from the beginning.
Right.
And they have what seems on the surface and we can talk more about this, but what to me feels like a really innocuous interaction. They're just kind of catching up. And the dancer brings up the story that our writer wrote, and that upon reading it, he took down the painting. And it seems like under the surface, at least for our protagonist, so much is kind of roiling, right? Yeah. She feels threatened being in the presence of the dancer. And that's how our story kind of comes to an end. I think the interaction with the dancer makes her incredibly paranoid, and at the end of the story, she starts to hear a child screaming, actually. Yeah. And our story kind of goes full circle, and we come back to the Your Honor that she addressed at the beginning. And she tells the judge, I guess we can say it's the judge, right? Your Honor, she tells the judge that this is when she began to distrust herself. And that's when our story comes to a close.
Thanks for that overview.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I just realized how true it was that we gave the poet this
Yes.
overview of a story
Yeah.
that is about a fiction writer.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
hearing you speak made me think about how you're giving her, I think, more credit of being than I will. So we'll see.
I would love to talk more about
over
that.
Things.
The narrator, I think, does give a lot of room for us to interpret her motives and her sort of thought process. And I guess I want to talk about the Your Honor address first a little bit, because in a way, this story, it's very easy to forget in the middle of it that this is sort of technically an address to a second person judge, right? But I do feel like as you get into the story, there are all these layers. It's a story within a story within a story. And so I'm curious what you all make of that structure.
What do you think?
Well, I think that in some ways this feels like a writer's story. You know, people throw around that term, but I think that this is grappling with, I think, the big questions of what stories can we tell, and tackling it from different, you know, angles. And I view the honor as her asking the readers, right, for the to make a judgment about these choices that she made.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I'm supposed to be reading it seriously always, or if it's sort of like, you know, she's already made these choices.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I feel remorse, let's say.
Yeah, well said. I think I feel the same tensions in the story. I think that the narrator is extremely intelligent, self-aware, and yet I read most of the story as her trying to rationalize these choices that she's made. In certain ways, the story feels kind of analogous to a psychoanalytic encounter. Like, I read that Your Honor is not just like a judge, but perhaps like a psychoanalyst in a way. And it feels like she is so self-aware and she knows that she's made these choices, and yet I think she's capable of profound deception too, deceiving herself mostly.
Absolutely.
Talking about the ethics of being a writer, right? But really, she's hurt many people in her life.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And to your point, I do think you can read the story as being having a kind of metaphorical Your Honor. Or I think you can even read it literally. Like, I do think there's a way in which the Your Honor address kind of serves as a very writerly move, where it's like the so what of the story. Like, I think that you can sort of have this jumble of things, this sort of like strange encounter with the German dancer and this sort of ripple effects, and then the so what is like, well, we're meant to assume that she's done something even more terrible that's not on the page, which has brought her to trial. Like, I think that's kind of how I read it. I read it like in this very like strangely literal way, where I was like, okay, this woman is on trial, she did something terrible.
Who did she kill?
She like because of this distrust that was sown by the events
what libel
of this
did she
narrative.
commit?
Precisely.
Right.
Then she did something even worse. So it sort of like, I think, leaves a lot of room open for like a whole spectrum of interpretation. Right?
Absolutely. And I think I'm really torn by how much remorse would be there if she hadn't run into the dancer ultimately, because she says that thing about how, you know, she thought about sending the dancer the story and then doesn't, right? And years go on. So, you know, I'm not someone who, you know, feels like she needed to send that story for sure. But I do think that a lot of these questions about what right she has to tell these stories, you know, really come up because the dancer is still living, unlike her father who can't be there, right? I mean, she even says, I probably wouldn't have written this story if my father was still alive, right?
Yeah. And I'm curious, I mean, do you guys have an opinion about like which is the like more ethical story to tell? Is it the story about the painters that she writes, or is it the story about her father? And I'm curious if you even see those as competing, like which one was the greater transgression?
I mean, you know, I come to this story as a poet, not as a fiction writer, and I think about the infamous case of the poet Robert Lowell taking letters from his wife, the writer Elizabeth Hardwick, and using direct quotes from her in his sonnets in The Dolphin. And his sort of confidant and friend Elizabeth Bishop, right, she famously responds to Lowell's poems and says, art just isn't worth that much. And I often bring that to this story, and I try to think about whether our protagonist has crossed a line. And I buy what she's saying. I think that the writer should have immense freedom. But then I also question it too.
Of course.
What do you think?
I think that's a great example, and I think that the fiction world is just littered with these kind of questions, right? What is interesting is when I've taught this story with my students, it's always super divided. And I ask that question, and you know, I don't think either is egregious, right? Because that's my stance on it. But it's easier said, right? Probably than when it happens to you. And you know, I once had a friend who had a story written about themselves, and it was really interesting to watch it from that very real angle, and the strangeness of that. But in theory, kind of like your example, or you know, another thing I once heard is Alexander McQueen talking about it's just clothes.
It's just clothes.
Right? I do think that's a healthy approach to it. But I really am very interested in if we're going to say that this was some kind of transgression, which is worse. And I think that ultimately most people that I've talked to, most students, fall down that there's somehow more of a right to talk about the father than there was to the stranger. But what's interesting about it to me is that the stranger, it's not his story either. So it's a little bit whispered down the lane already. Whereas like the example with the father feels like more of a direct ripping off of a story.
And in fact, I mean, you could say that the German dancer was all too ready to share this story.
It's a great dinner party conversation.
Exactly.
And yet he seems, when they encounter each other in the park, he's not openly aggressive with her. But his gestures toward her, he taps her on the shoulder. How would you describe how he feels toward her, how he acts toward her? Again, it's what I do love about this story is that, I mean, most of the dialogue is in, you guys are fiction writers, but I think it's free and direct discourse, right? It feels so rooted in her interiority, and we never really have access to anyone else. And I think that's what draws me to the story. It feels so insular and elusive and mysterious to me. And we don't know what the dancer thinks, but you know, do you think he's offended? Do you think that is he offended by what she's done?
It's hard. I mean, I don't know if it's a good question. And I don't know if offended is the word I would choose, but I almost feel, and I love that gesture is like such a perfect nugget in the story that's open for interpretation. Like by its very nature, like we don't get to like literally see it. We have to sort of see what how it was described, filtered through her mind, right? But I do almost read that moment as like he can see that she's not at peace with it, and I almost feel like he's like reflecting back like her own anxieties or like feelings of tension back at her. Like I almost feel like what is like maybe like quote made clear to him in that moment is that like she made this choice and she's living with consequences too a little bit.
Right, and I think that he himself learned some kind of lesson about, you know, what he should keep for himself, right? And I think keep calling him the dancer, right? And I feel like in those first opening paragraphs, we get these great descriptions of how this dancer moves his body and that, you know, she almost doesn't like him moving in mundane ways. She wants him to like lift off, right? And that made me think about what the narrator's gift is, right? And where she herself like lifts off, and it is in this kind of making sense of pain, right? In kind of forming or reforming our stories into kind of better stories in a way, right? And so maybe there, from artist to artist, there's a little bit of appreciation there, right? I do wonder that because we, you know, after she hears the story of the initial story of the painter, she's like riding home with her husband, right? Who I don't think is an artist. And he kind of gives this, you know, very normal, very kind, compassionate response, like, you know, that's terrible or whatever he says. But he doesn't know what to do with it. And she does. She knows what to do with it, just like the dancer knows what to do with his body. But still, I think, even if he on one half of his head can appreciate that, the fact that he doesn't tell her what, you know, his thoughts are now, I do think is a very calculated move. That's how I saw it.
There's power in withholding.
There's power in withholding. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm glad you both brought that up. I think that the dancer and our narrator have a really tense, contentious relationship. And I often have read her, if we want to call it her theft of his story or his personal history. I've read that as her, in a way, maybe trying to best him. I think that she seems to have a lot of anxiety about his prowess, his litheness, his grace, right? She herself can't have children. We learned that in the cab ride home. It seems like she's projecting a lot of her anxieties and her frustrations onto him. And this kind of taking of his story is a way to assert her dominance over him. Yeah, truly.
Yeah. No, that's a helpful way to think about it.
I think I have a really psychoanalytic reading of the story.
Zadie Smith calls, fiction writing the indefensible art.
Yeah.
So I think
Why
very
not?
true, right?
Yeah, but I do think it matters to your point that he's a dancer and that we sort of get that the story begins with him and his like kind of amazing capabilities, right?
Yeah.
And I do think what's funny about a story that's so like meta like this is that we don't get to read her version of the story. Like, we don't get to read what she published about either her father or
That's
these
true.
young painters.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it feels like a conversation like about judging her choice would be easier if we could say like, well, the story was really good, so it was worth it, right? Like we don't know how good it is.
Yeah.
But I almost feel like because the dancer, like I feel like we can trust that this dancer really is talented, and I feel like because like they are worthy opponents, it helps me trust that maybe she is also talented too.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like thinking of her as a talented writer. And, one thing we wanted to talk about, right, was if we believe or trust this narrator.
Yeah.
And I think that because she is so smooth in a way and kind of so intelligent and I think very vulnerable at the end in particular, she earns my trust as a reader. I would be interested though, because it doesn't seem like any of us think of what she has done as despicable, right?
I don't, but we're also all writers.
I know,
and
so I feel like we should have another person at the table, right?
Yeah.
Because I do feel like, for me, she's not a flawed protagonist from the beginning. And it would be interesting to discuss the story more with people, right, who, are really saying that what she's doing is inappropriate.
Yeah.
I know people are going to think that writers just eat cupcakes and write about everything.
And we do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I've taught this story to both undergraduates and high school students, and both sort of crops of students are often offended by what she's done. Mostly what I do, and we'll read the story, we'll discuss it, and then I make students, I sort of separate them into arbitrary groups of kind of pro and for and against the writer, and we sort of make our own kind of courtroom in the class. And we sort of defend or prosecute her. And often the prosecution has the most resonant case. In a way, it is really easy, I think, to condemn her for what she's done. I think I think we value privacy. I think we value sanctity of one's own stories, right? And I think people really are kind of aggrieved by what she's done, at least my students and me in many ways. You've taught the story, you've taught the story.
Yeah.
What were your experiences teaching it?
Yeah.
Well, something that is interesting to me, I had a student bring up once, was about the structure itself. So we actually spend a long time in that opening scene, right?
Yeah.
Where we learn about the painter and the story and kind of her subsequent career and different things. And then we skip ahead in time and we have a few lines about writing the novel about the father.
Yeah.
And so that's quite minimized, right? So I've had students talk about how it was a choice to, not reverse it in a way, right? Like, this is the story of me writing a story about my father. And I've done this before in this other realm. And so I think that's a kind of an interesting perspective to bring to it. I think why she made this choice was because honestly, the painter's story is more salacious, right? It's more kind of, it feels stolen to me in a way. But I guess because I find that, especially for early novelists and stuff, you do see people stealing from their families a little bit more. I actually think it takes more skill and craft to make a story out of the painter's story. In a way, to build out of that.
I mean, that story is like a sort of it has like mythical. It's like mythically awful. Sort of what happens. So I do think to spin something out of that does take a lot of. Again, it's weird to talk about a story we haven't read. A story that's written, but like, I assume it's very skillful. Actually, I find myself thinking that. Yeah. I mean, I find that students get really hung up on the scream, kind of like at the end, which is probably worth digging into.
I think so too.
Yeah, and I do feel like with the Scream, I don't know. I mean, I think when I've talked about it with students, I sort of always say, like, I feel like that is her punishment. Like, I sort of feel like, in a way, like, whether or not it's, like, right or wrong, like, I sort of feel like she's allowed to write when she wants to write. It's just that there are consequences sometimes, right? That's how I read the Scream. And it kind of reminds me of, I don't know if you both have seen Tar, the movie.
Yes.
But it almost reminds me of like
a great companion text, I think, for this story, genuinely.
Yeah, well, it kind of reminds me of the moment, like in the, you know, dank sort of dark catacombs of the city with like the mythical, the beast like roaring a little bit. Like that's kind of what I feel like that Scream is in this story. It's like the psychic like scream kind of coming for you.
I do also read it as her punishment in a way. How do you think of it?
I think
or her paranoia, maybe.
Right.
I should say.
You know,
made real.
I think that what's great about how this story ends is it ends in a very material way, in that we, you know, she's walking by after meeting or after reuniting with the dancer after all these years, and she's, you know, I think she's walking by a schoolyard and, you know, there's a scream and she doesn't know where it comes from. And so then the scream haunts her, right? And what I liked about it was so much of the story seemed like, you know, stories about stories, right? And then here we have something that is actually happening to her. And the scream haunts her, but what I think is very interesting about it is she doesn't, on one level, she can't make a story out of this, right? But on the second level, we're reading a story about this. So I don't know. This is where my trust in her kind of flickers, because she's very explicitly broken the wall where she is talking to us, Your Honor. So she was able to do something with that scream and make this story. So I don't know. If
it feels like a flourish, like it feels like an artistic move.
It feels like for me, yes, this scream might be haunting her, but she's still able to use it to create art.
That's really interesting. I've thought often about like whether if this were like a story that like someone, we're all MFA people, but if this were brought to workshop, right? I would maybe question the scream as too on the nose.
Yeah, right? I know, it's always tempting to question that. But I think reading it and not workshopping it, I'm actually like, oh, that is like, it's like that dramatic moment you crave as a reader.
I think a lot of great quirks of published stories that are highly treasured would be smoothed out in a workshop setting. So Queensland, So I don't think, it's nice to have you here because I don't think we've actually brought up workshop at all in that way.
I can't believe I did it.
No. Yeah, we'll tar and feather you later.
Should we talk about our favorite line?
I think so.
Yeah.
Oh, am I first today?
Yeah.
So my favorite line comes from that reunion with the dancer. And she says, "Do you?" I said, surprised and suddenly agitated, but he smiled again. And it seemed to me that the danger had passed. The story would go unmentioned. And so I'm not as interested in this line for like the context of it, and we've talked about the context a lot. I'm interested in how she moves us through one emotion to the other in kind of a single line. I think, you know, she goes from being surprised to agitated, right, to feeling the danger has passed, and then sort of secure that the story would go unmentioned. And I think it's such a skill to be able to capture all the emotions that can go through a mind in the breath of one sentence. And to do it so eloquently, you know. I also just, you know, she has a great hyphen here, which I just love too. So, and dash, so it's great.
Yeah, there's a lot of good compression in this story, actually, where she's like very efficient in a way. Even though the story is kind of like shapeless sometimes, I do think there are like these very efficient sentences in there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think I'm drawn also to the spareness, the directness, the kind of austereness of the story. And my favorite line too is also from the what I might call the climax of the story, where she runs into the dancer in Washington Square Park. It's such a tense scene, and she's regarding the dancer, and she notes that he smiled in a genuine way, a way that always makes me, with my unrelenting self-consciousness, feel slightly nervous and embarrassed when I encounter it, knowing that I could never be so easy, open, or fluent. And again, we feel she's enormously intelligent. We feel her writerly intelligence at work. This phrase, unrelenting self-consciousness, right? Ascribing that to herself, right? And we feel that she is so nervous around the dancer. He's fluent, which I think using the word fluent to characterize someone's gestures, their mannerisms, I can feel her envy, the kind of depth of it, how much it kind of terrorizes her, and I think it plays a great role in her writing of this titular story.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it gets at how like the story tonally is very cool. Like the story is
removed.
Which I think plays up my trust and my distrust of her. Like I trust her as a writer because of the control of it. But I distrust anybody who has such a cool tone in a way.
Yeah.
And that question makes me think, do you think she actually creates fictive work, this author? Or is she someone who is mostly writing from reality? Because we get that scene where she talks about like in interviews, I say all the right things and I, say that, it's alchemy or whatnot. But we know as the readers that she's pulling very, very heavily. And I think what ruffled my feathers in that scene was writers do actually create, right? Like she might not be that kind of writer. But a lot of writers aren't just writing autofiction.
Right.
Many aren't.
Right? So maybe her other novels aren't? What do you think?
I wonder if she's undergone a kind of trajectory, if she started writing fiction that felt more fully imagined, and then she sort of transitioned into what we might call autofiction. I sort of think of her as analogous to like a Rachel Cusk or something. I don't know.
Well, tone-wise, definitely. Like coolness.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to steal this piece of paper to read my favorite.
Okay. Let's hear it.
Thank you. Okay. I chose this one. Furthermore, after the story was published, I stopped thinking about the mother and her children who had burned to death in a car, as if by writing about them I had made them disappear. And I'm interested in this for a few reasons. I mean, one, I just think that the furthermore, like, that word, like, at the beginning of that sentence is a reminder of the pleading your case, right? Like, it sort of is like a story, again, that begins and ends with a Your Honor, but is quite subtle in the middle about taking, like, just a few moments to remind you of, like, the context, like, the frame story at hand here. So I'm interested in how just the word furthermore does that. And then also just this idea that, like, in a way, that's such a cold sentiment, right? To make something disappear by writing about it. It's almost like this whole time we've been talking about her motives. In some ways, she does just sort of tell us who she is in a way, right? Like, and I almost feel like, I don't know, she's sort of not burying the lead. She's like, I did this and I made them disappear. That's a cold move. And so the honesty there feels calculated, but I also respect it in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I would be curious with both of you when you're writing, do you have that experience of disappearance after you put something out there?
I feel like often sometimes my goal in writing something in the first place is to get it out of my mind. I don't know whether that's always successful afterwards, but that's often like a motivation for writing something.
Right.
For me too. I mean, writing, I think the longer I do it, and I think when I started doing it, it has always felt like a compulsion in some way. And I think the desire to do it is to be able to hold something, to not let it best you in some way, to be able to control it, and to assert some kind of meaning or dominance over it. And in fact, I'm happy that you brought up this moment in the story, because it actually is the moment in the story when I feel the most sympathy for our narrator, actually. I feel how much writing is a kind of compulsion for her. It's something that she has to do. It isn't just a kind of hobby or something. I think she's a real artist.
And it's interesting to me because as much as it disappears from her, it appears in the world after what she's done.
That strange tension.
So she gives it away, and it's out there. And that kind of almost brings us full circle to what the dancer could have meant, right? By, by his kind of lingering fluent touch, right? She couldn't read it, right? She didn't read that language. But maybe in a way, she did help it to disappear within him too. Like maybe he gave it away to her, or maybe he's given it away to lots of people, and they just haven't done something with it. That might be a stretch, but
I don't know. I think you're onto something there. Yeah, in a way, when you need to give something away, it's also a sign that like it is heavy, it is real, it like matters, it like needs to be offloaded. I don't know. It's a different way of respecting something.
But your furthermore, so we didn't really touch on that. I do think it's legalistic.
Yes.
So,
It slips in that
slips
jargon.
in. So I agree.
Yeah. This is fun to talk about.
This is wonderful. Yeah. Thank you so much, Nathan, for joining us. I hope you'll come back sometime.
An honor. Yes, thanks for having me.
Your honor. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks. Take care.
Ciao.
Bye.